Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's talk, Dead Heroines, by art historian Jenni Sorkin. My name's Robert Leckie, and I'm director here at Spike Island. We're really delighted to host this talk on the occasion of Rosemary Mayer's survey exhibition, Ways of Attaching, at Spike Island. And this event also celebrates the imminent launch of Rosemary Mayer's exhibition catalogue, to which Jenni has also contributed and which is now available to pre-order on our website. Before we get started, I'd just like to cover some practicalities. So the event will last around 1 hour. For the first 40 minutes, Jenni will introduce and expand on the historical and cultural context of Mayer's early works, analysing her materials, forms, and titles through the lens of historical feminist practices. And then we will open to questions and comments from the audience. So if you'd like to contribute, please do share any questions or comments on the YouTube chat, and I will do my best to communicate those to Jenni when the time comes. Also, just a reminder that all of Spike Island's public programs seek to create an environment for critical and open-minded discussion. So we politely ask that all comments are respectful and generative for our guest and audience. Closed captions are also available on YouTube, so just click the link, click the closed caption button to enable them if you require them. I'd like to flag that this event is made possible through the West of England Visual Arts Alliance and supported by Arts Council England, so thank you to them for their support. And to end, I just want to briefly introduce our guest. So Jenni Sorkin is Associate Professor of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her books include Live Form, Women's Ceramics and Community, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2016, and Art in California, published by Thames and Hudson in 2021. She's also published widely in museum and exhibition catalogues, scholarly publications on American art, and as a critic for Art Forum, Art Monthly, Frieze, Third Text, and more. So Jenni, we're very happy to have you here with us, and please take it away when you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert and Nella, for inviting me. I'm so glad to be able to share this work with a larger audience, and I'm thrilled the show has traveled to Bristol. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay, because I can't see my, yeah, okay, great. All right. This talk is titled Dead Heroines, and before I get started, I just want to dedicate this talk to, in memory of Bernadette Mayer, Rosemary Mayer's younger sister who passed away last week. And so we are in memoriam for her right now. So thank you. During the 1970s, feminist artists, archaeologists, and historians fervently sought out matrilineal antecedents in world culture and historic civilizations whom centuries of patriarchy had overlooked. The goddess imagery that permeated the era's art making and women's culture more generally was an outgrowth of this research. For many, this impulse was realized in ways that was largely figurative and corporeal, such as in body-based feminist performances, such as Betsy Damon's 7,000-Year-Old Woman, a live event in which the artist's nude body was encased in hundreds of flower-filled pouches that were subsequently cut open during a soliloquy about memory and ritual. While Damon gestured toward a universal mother figure, Rosemary Mayer made textile-based abstract sculptures that referenced historically specific figures. A lifelong New Yorker who steeped her material-driven artistic practice in arcane intellectual inquiry, Mayer is best known as one of the founding members of the New York feminist cooperative AIR Gallery in 1972. Throughout her career, Mayer rooted both her art production and writing in the idea of secular ancestor worship, reclaiming forgotten and overlooked women predecessors who she once slyly described as, quote, ideas of deity and dead heroines, end quote, hence my title. And this is just to show you a really lovely Sylvia Slay portrait. Can you hear me or no? You're waving. What am I? Okay. I don't know what you're saying, Robert, because you're on mute.
The presentation isn't full screen.
It's not in full screen? Not
No.
in full screen. Oh, okay. Better? Now it's in full screen. Okay, thank you. This is just to point out a really lovely portrait that Sylvia Slee did. And I believe this is Rosemary Mayer in it. And Howardina Pindell was also a member of this gallery, and she has a show coming up in Bristol as well at Spike Island. Mayer arrived at the medium of fabric through the influence of late modernist painting and post-minimalist art, in particular the work of Eva Hesse, Morris Louis, Robert Morris, and Alan Serrett. During her years in art school, she experimented with shaped and curved canvases and using the canvas as a primary material ahead of her work with textiles. She also used dyeing as a way of painting, making fabric in solid, bright colors, such as Untitled 68, or gathered her canvases with rope, not unlike curtains. In doing so, she sought to highlight the inflexibilities of painting as a medium. She confronted the frustrating flatness of hard-edged abstraction by softening its hard edges, while also rejecting the dimensionality that painting had historically achieved through skilled trickery, that is, vanishing point perspective and illusionism. Mayer was in good company. She was part of a loose grouping of young abstract painters in 1970s New York who were forging spatial relationships by painting with fabric, while using the canvas simultaneously as support and foil. Using various techniques such as fabric collage, sewing, decorative motifs borrowed from textiles, this group engaged in experiments with three-dimensional surfaces. In doing so, they sought to treat the surface of the canvas as an object that might be sewn, perforated, textured, and bunched, and in the process explored perception, space, and the emotive possibilities of materials. These artists included Susan Kreil, Mary Heilman, Al Loving, Joan Lyons, Howardina Pindell, Alan Shields, who you see here, and others. Nevertheless, when the critic Carter Ratliff identified a generation of artists he termed, quote, the new informalists, he only included Shields. Ratliff aimed to describe painters whose lush sense of color reclaimed the haptic through producing stained and densely textured surfaces. He wrote, quote, of all the possibilities for color, the first to reappear is its tactility as against its use in creating optical space. Though he did not address Mayer's work, this idea in hindsight clarifies aspects of her practice at the time. Ratliff, like other male critics of the era, was biased against what he saw as feminine and therefore negative characteristics of women's work. Women utilizing textiles, in his view, treaded dangerously close to amateurism. Better to leave craft-inflected content to heterosexual men like Shields, who could launder textiles, quite literally, through a vocabulary of painting, thus retaining its muscularity. This masculine sensibility was still one of the art world requirements of the era. Museums and galleries overwhelmingly showed men only, excluding women artists, which fueled, in part, the new forms of dissent coalescing in the feminist movement. As an active member of AIR Gallery, Mayer was a part of this story and showed in separatist or women's-only exhibitions throughout the 1970s. Mayer pursued art making circuitously. Born and raised in Brooklyn, she and her younger sister, the poet Bernadette Mayer, were orphaned as young teenagers when their parents died within 2 years of each other. In spite of this tragedy, Mayer pursued a college education. Along the way, she married in 1962, at age 19, the poet and artist Vito Acconci. Together, the young couple left Brooklyn, pursuing their respective educations jointly at University of Iowa, both finishing in 1964. Mayer graduated with a bachelor's degree in classics, Acconci with a master's degree in creative writing. Acconci collaborated with Mayer's sister, also a poet, to self-publish the experimental poetry magazine 0 to 9, produced in 7 mimeographed editions between 1967 and 1969, to which Rosemary also contributed. The independent-minded Mayer soon declined a fellowship in classics at Harvard to pursue her own artistic practice. She returned to New York to embark upon formal artistic study at the Brooklyn Museum School, followed by the School of Visual Arts, which she attended from 1967 to 69. Her marriage to Akanchi ended at this time during 68. Writing in her diary, quote, "I gave up painting in second year at SVA because I thought of that sort of work as indulgence in loveliness for its own sake and nothing more," end quote. SVA was where she met the artist Adrian Piper, who became an important friend and confidant. They would soon be members of the same feminist consciousness-raising group. As an outright rejection of loveliness, Mayer initially made use of found and gifted materials, many that came early on from her friend, the poet Hannah Weiner, who worked as a lingerie designer and brought her leftover textile scraps, likely sheer fabrics. Money was an ongoing and pressing concern, a low hum of anxiety that coursed through her diaries. She saved and scrimped to purchase new fabric by the yard. Over this time, this exigency coalesced into a purposeful strategy, processing fabric on her own, such as dyeing by the bolt. Mayer was not alone in these aesthetic experiments. In maximizing her under-resourced artistic practices, her investment in mining the sentimentalism of color and tactility was shared by her close friend, the artist Ree Morton, who wrote in her own sketchbooks that good decoration is symbolic. By embracing the symbolically loaded feminine iconography, Mayer sought to puncture the cerebral rhetoric around material experiments produced by her own generation, that is, male purveyors of process art, such as Robert Morris, Barry Levah, or Richard Serra, among others included in Marcia Tucker's and James Monti's groundbreaking exhibition Anti-Illusion, Procedures, Materials, held at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1969. Within her most intimate circles, of course, a distinct line of conceptualism was also in play. Both Akanchi and Piper became crucial foils in Mayer's practice. They were sharp critics to push back against, both in moments of self-doubt, but also in the light of the intense clarity she felt in arguing her way toward a decidedly unmonumental practice. As she wrote in her 1971 diary, talking to Adrian about the clash of brutal paint services with lovely fabrics, she says how that's me, that my urge to make a middle ground is really not a good idea, that I ought to accept the hard, brutal parts of me. The middle ground Mayer mentions here was a merging between fabric and paint, an attempt to move forward in her spatial practice without succumbing to loveliness. Yet Mayer would soon take Piper's advice to heart. Her internal clashes moved on from a feminist iconography of material gestures and instead turned outward, projecting her social and personal concerns onto a set of historical inquiries. That is, the hard, brutal parts became the dramatic and often violent histories of women wronged throughout Western history. Ahead of Judy Chicago, Mayer got to Hiroswitha, first in 1972, by naming an abstract fiber sculpture after the earliest documented female poet and dramatist in medieval Germany, and perhaps in all of Europe, after the fall of the ancient world. Yet Hiroswitha, also sometimes known as Hirosvitha, never became a household name, despite being later celebrated with a place setting within Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, surely the late 20th century's most prominent soiree. Mayer's Hiroswitha, by contrast with Chicago's, is a fabric chandelier with 4 curvaceous tiers, a series of inverted, unfinished skirts. The work's opaque fabrics, flannel and rayon, are draped rather than stretched, concave subjects affixed to a loose armature of wooden rods, some with fiberglass wrapping. A ghostly object in billowing black and red, her sculpture presents Hiroswitha as tantalizing and unfamiliar, The precarity of the piece underscores the impermanence of female cultural producers, even those who were once lauded. This is just to show you the entirety of the dinner party. And a recent installation of Hiroswitha. The coincidence of the shared historical reference provokes a comparison between these two feminist artists, one working in New York, the other in California. Both worked through an abstract vocabulary of fragile empowerment and drew heavily on the concept of women's work. Excuse me. Mayer worked with textiles, Chicago with porcelain, painting, and embroidery. Both were committed to applying contemporary ideas retroactively to a pre-modern world. Yet the difference is also striking. The dinner party was a massive project undertaken in a collective manner, with Chicago crediting her volunteers, friends, and participants. Diane Gellin, Chicago's research and project coordinator, was a graduate student in art history and was tasked with historical research. It is likely she who found Hiroswitha's name. Mayer, by contrast, worked in a solitary and scholarly way, keeping records, journals, and notebooks, embarking her own sense of self-discovery and critical awareness. Another important distinction were their respective approaches to skilled craft. New York's art scene neither admired nor rewarded the skills associated with fabric and textile construction. The hard-earned proficiencies of knotting, netting, weaving, coiling, stitching, and knitting. Despite their visible use of textiles, Mayer's predecessors, including Hessa, Robert Morris, Fred Sandbach, and Lucas Samaras, did not use handmade materials, generally opting instead for those that were industrially produced. Largely trained as painters, they did not have the skills necessary to build architectonic textile sculptures from scratch. Nor for that matter did Mayer, who compensated by using rudimentary construction skills, such as draping in the earliest years of her practice, which required no intensive planning. As she wrote in 1978, referring back to the period of 70 to 72, quote, "I was concerned to produce complexity from simple means. Most of the ways the pieces from this time are constructed are very simple, but hung up with fabric draping, they are visually complex," end quote. As her work became more elaborate, she began using more traditional construction methods, which she taught herself: measuring, marking, basting, cutting, pinning, and sewing. Matters of craft and skill were of a central concern in the American art of this moment. In her 2010 book, String Felt Thread, The Hierarchy of Art and Craft in American Art, art historian Elisa Author argues that there was a, quote, "change in status from the maker and the object," end quote, in relation to hierarchies of skill and utilitarianism, as avant-garde tastemakers such as galleries, critics, and artists sought to insulate themselves from accusations of being called non-art in exploration of new materials and processes. Author points out that Morris himself set the tone for the critical response of his large-scale felt works by reproducing images of them in an art form treatise titled Anti-Form in April of 1968. These distinctions played out equally as differences between the East Coast and West. California was a hotbed of textile-based abstraction and one of the sites of origin for the studio fiber movement. Hand-woven and off-loom processes like knotting and braiding became its artists' primary means of producing large-scale sculptural installations. New York's studio fiber movement, by contrast, invested in the industrial hardness of minimalism, architectural interventions, and urban installations. Let us now return to Mayer's title figure. Then, as now, there is little historiographical information on Hiroswitha. She is credited as writing a cycle of 6 plays, which constitute, according to medieval scholar Daniel Frankfurter, the earliest attempt at Christian theater as a rejection of pagan comedies. Women are the primary protagonists in all Hiroswitha's known works. Forgotten for centuries, her work was discovered by a monk in the early 16th century, but then fell out of favor again. In the modern era, as Frankfurter notes, quote, Heroswitha constituted such a challenge to common prejudices concerning medieval women that in the mid-19th century, an effort was made to argue her out of existence, end quote. The idea of arguing a woman out of existence is something that Mayer was keenly aware of throughout her oeuvre. She conceived of many of her textile-based installations as an act of invocation, titling a large-scale gossamer work with the name of a mythic or historical, and usually less than canonical, female figure. Some of her best-known works are those devoted to Galla Placida, a late antique Roman empress, and Hypaspopol, the mythic queen of Limnos and granddaughter of Ariadne, the goddess of mazes and labyrinths. Made variously of cheesecloth, netting, nylon, ribbon, cord with wooden supports, Mayer's cloth-based installations became symbolic gestures of presence and absence, while being simultaneously homages to what she called dead heroines. Mayer also experimented with merged identities. For instance, the Catherines is a sculpture composed of sewn fabric attached to wooden supports and draped from 8 points that attach to the wall itself using metal hardware. A bundle of eggplant chartreuse, pale yellow and orange, precariously supporting its own curvature and weight. These swaths of fabric create a sense of interiority, encasing or protecting a secret core, and billowing in such a way as to loom larger than the absent body inside of them. Mayer's title may reference any number of Catherines, including Catherine of Siena, a medieval mystic who became a primary intellectual within the confines of the all-male papacy. She fasted, died at 33, and was later canonized as a saint. Or perhaps Mayer references the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, a patron of arts and culture in Renaissance England, as the first wife of Henry VIII. She was Queen of England until the monarch had their marriage annulled to make room for Anne Boleyn. See also Catherine de' Medici, Italian noblewoman and mother of kings, and the Prussian Empress Catherine the Great, well known for her sexual conquests. The stories then pile up. There is a single work, no longer extant, named De Medici, of draped brown and yellow rayon with white lace, cords, and brown netting. Like the Catherines, it is a work that curls in on itself, creating the impression of a pocket or an interior private space. Whether they were consciously vaginal or vulvic, many of her draping techniques end in a V configuration or create a series of pouches, such as the shapes that curve outward from the wall. Here's a really nice drawing of De Medici. Seen in the study for Heroswitha, or in the empty internal space centered in the middle of transparent fabric, such as this untitled drawing. Then there is Hypatia, a textile sculpture named for the Greek female astronomer and mathematician who was murdered by a Christian mob in the waning days of the Roman Empire. Here, Mayer produces another 4-tiered structure, this time loosely conceived in the shape of an ivory satin dress. Its waist is cinched by rope and wire. It is pinned to the wall, shielded by a partial layer of translucent cheesecloth that resembles tulle or veil-like netting. Hypatia was also represented in the dinner party, and a decade later, in 1983, became the honorific title of a peer-reviewed feminist philosophy journal. In all these references, Mayer was influenced by her upbringing in the Roman Catholic Church, a training crystallized through a patriarchal education during her formative years, and nearly daily, sometimes twice daily, attendance at Mass with her deeply religious parents. The impact of Catholicism was deeply felt. In Mayer's diary, she writes of reading Anais Nin's diary and underscoring her identification with experiences of the famous French erotic writer. She writes, quote, A.N.'s description of her submissive, obedient Catholic childhood struck home. So did her conviction that it had undermined her self-confidence. Indeed, Mayer's practice insists upon the messy aesthetics of decomposition, as in her choice to use synthetic fabrics, many of which have degraded over time, appearing worn or faded. The disintegration itself becomes a metaphor for the degradation of historical female achievement. The very idea of gendered excellence is imagined as literally worn down by history itself, fragmentary, ephemeral, and perennially tucked in between the strata of men, persistently present yet unwelcome. Oblique and monumental, Mayer's textile sculptures are less memorials than shrines. Handmade, furiously passionate attempts at abstracting female forms while disrupting cultural amnesia, the long-term cycle of overlooking, burying, and otherwise forgetting women's accomplishments. Further, shrines have distinctly pious overtones associated with ritual textiles, Catholic pageantry, and ceremonial rites. In their earliest religious forms, shrines have strongly pagan roots, which Mayer embraced. As she recorded in a meditation on her mid-1970s works, quote, "For a while it was important to celebrate possible energies near deity," end quote. How then does Mayer's attenuated portraits of dead heroines compare with Chicago's version? Years later, Mayer did become aware of Chicago's work through her primary means of accruing information, that is, reading. In a 1979 letter to her sister, Mayer takes a direct swipe at Chicago's work, deriding it as a form of propaganda. Quote, "About Judy Chicago, well, I don't think she is much of an artist, and her autobiography, well, I dare you to endure it. However, maybe it's good such militancy gets around and spreads the message, but it's so simplified a message," end quote. Perhaps Mayer found Chicago to be too confident or even too radical. But this is not to say that one approach is superior or even that they were in opposition. Indeed, the matter of simplicity is a crux for both artists, if differently so. Chicago placed a premium on skilled craft to convey her direct message of inclusion. Mayer, by contrast, was a de-skilled artist working through simplified and amateur forms of making while aiming to produce complexity from simple means. And both artists, excuse me, along with a much larger group of peers that included Linda Bangwis, Mary Beth Edelson, Anna Mendieta, and Carolee Schneemann, were invested in the intellectual richness of affect and in feeling toward matrilinear forms through conceptually inflected goddess imagery, performance, and sculpture. Mayer's materialism indeed turned performative by the early 1980s. She shifted away from indoor sculptural installations to form a practice that engaged with the natural world. Using the full glory of outdoors, she pursued deeply ephemeral materials such as helium balloons, seen here, or snow effigies, as seen in Snow People, a temporary, eerie installation of 15 figures made upon a visit to her sister in Lenox, Massachusetts. Each snow person was bestowed with a plural name based upon popular 19th century naming practices in that town, producing snow memorials for all the Carolines, the Marys, the Annas, the Ediths, the Adelines. She also began to center her artistic practice around the lunar calendar. The moon is an ancient archetype associated with femininity, menstruation, and tidal forces. Mayer's Moon Tent was a performance event made at the art historian Robert Hobbs's upstate New York home. Mayer created a decorative viewing platform wrapping an existing gazebo structure with glassine paper. A group gathered to watch the full moon as it rose in the night sky. In her 1971 diary, Mayer wondered, quote, "Where is all the knowledge, astrology, myths, magic, feelings that my work doesn't now allow," end quote. Over the next decades, Mayer sought to locate and memorialize feminist and female accomplishment, working against her most cerebral impulses toward an enchanted sensibility of transformation, one that was spectral, fragile, and temporary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation. It's really wonderful for you to help us think through the importance and significance and kind of the different ways of attaching, if you will, if we can take it from the title, that Rosemary Mayer's work had with kind of peers, competitors, other people in the art world at the time. I'm going to look for some questions coming through on YouTube, but I think I would like to start also just by thinking through this idea that specifically the fabric sculptures, as you talked about, are thinking through women from history that have kind of been wiped out by some kind of cultural amnesia, and then the irony of Mayer's work itself also not necessarily being given the attention it deserves. And obviously the show that we're presenting and the kind of touring show that we've worked on with these brilliant partners is really about trying to kind of address that and say, hey, this work is really important, it deserves being looked at, it deserves attention. And so I wondered about your thoughts on that kind of irony inbuilt into her own thinking about the history of women, and their creativity and its kind of reflection on Mayer's work itself.
I think that's a really good kind of overview and series of questions, actually. I think it's really, I suspect that she knew her own sort of placement in sort of in the hierarchy of what we might say is the New York art world and the space of being so-called minor, working in a minor set of materials, living and working in New York for her entire lifetime, but maybe being considered minor or secondary in terms of not having gallery representation for the entirety of her career, really. Teaching at a community college, and then working with marginalized students or low-income students in that sense, and also recovering these sort of forgotten historical figures and mythic figures, which produce these spectacular installations. But I think that there's probably, you're in the space, and I'm sure that you get questions all the time what these titles mean, and how they should be interpreted, because they're completely arcane and kind of off the radar. And so I think that that's really purposeful in pairing these really gossamer and ephemeral materials with the ephemeral and temporal nature of or the fleetingness of fame, or of notoriety in some way, or of historical depth even. And even to go back to Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, most of the names on those plates are really unknown still to the larger general populace. And so I think it speaks to this forgetting or overlooking or purposeful erasure, which I think is what Mayer is arguing in her body of work, toward women's achievements and accomplishments. And I think it's very hard not to read pieces of that through the sort of framework of her own biography as well, since she was so diaristic in her kind of ways of working.
The thing that's really interesting about the coming together of Gala Placidia and Hypsipyle in this slide is also that the thing that's interesting, and one of the questions that does come up when we get visitors in the gallery is like asking about these figures, asking about the kind of origins of these works. And in this example, Hypsipyle is a kind of mythological figure, and then Gala Placidia is a real like region of the Western Roman Empire, I think, whereas Hypsipyle was a queen of Lemnos in ancient Greece. And so you kind of have this mixing also of kind of facts and myth in a way that I think is really kind of compelling. Yeah.
I think that is compelling, and I think also the fact that these names are not easy to memorize. For instance, one trips on them often because we're not used to speaking, or generally people are not so knowledgeable, myself included, about ancient Greek and Roman pronunciations. And I think that that's that's part of the difficulty of committing these works to memory, is that the fabrics start to blur together, the names start to blur together, it's hard to separate them out, and they become really abstract pieces that, because you don't have, and I think this is also her real intent here, is to the erasure of the figure. We have this kind of these figurey forces, and they have a kind of spectral presence, but they're faceless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have another question from Nella, in fact, which is, do you think the New York context in particular affected how Mayer's work was or in fact wasn't received?
I think it certainly did. I think that she was working in a cutting edge way, but was just out of grasp in terms of getting recognition. Like she was in the right place at the right time, and for whatever reason, it didn't happen for her in this really sort of bigger way. She's slightly younger than Eva Hesse. Eva Hesse also gets to sort of replicate the tragic figure, in that her oeuvre, body of work is really slender. I mean, it's really productive, but it's just a couple of decades, decade and a half really, before she passes away. So she gets to be sort of the perennial beautiful youth of generationally, and I really wonder if the art world at that time has the room or space for more than one woman, because it's largely men who take over this kind of process and materials experimentation, which I suspect she and her peers were so frustrated with, in the sense that these are kind of, there's a kind of backstory of women's work in working with textiles, and then you have somebody like Robert Morris, who's made, these beautiful pieces out of industrial felt. He eschewed any kind of, production of the hand, and he just goes straight to industry, and he co-ops even, the femininity of pink here. And so I think that was probably, I don't know, hard to reconcile for feminists like Mayer, first coming into their own in this moment and trying to make sense of a world in which their entire art history up to that point was also all men. So to even recover these historical figures, it's not like you could find them on Wikipedia, which doesn't exist at the time, and there's no digital record. You have to go back to the history books, and do painstaking library research. And so I think that becomes one of the uphill battles of her work, is trying to reclaim these historical figures, which is why I've done such an active comparison here to Judy Chicago, who's on the West Coast doing the same sort of work in a very different way, except they both produce abstractions out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any more questions going through? I don't think so. In that case, I will ask another one, which is when you first kind of encountered Mayer's work and you were beginning to think about your contribution to the catalogue, what were you kind of what first drew you in?
I think it was the fact that she my name recognition of her had to do with the research that I've done around feminist alternative spaces, and so I knew her from AIR Gallery, but she doesn't spend terribly long there. I think she's gone by the third year of the gallery, I believe. So she comes in and out of it, and I think that it's a difficult space to work in, because at that time the meetings are all about coming up with consensus where everybody in the room has to agree before you can make decisions. And as we all know, that's a really quite arduous way to live in a structure with other people. It's about, eschewing or divesting a group of women from a patriarchal top-down model. And so for me, it was interesting to go to her diaries and be able to see her really wrestling with this problem of being in community and what does it mean to be a practicing artist in a feminist community, which is one of, I would say, the primary joys and maybe forces of my own practice of trying to uncover and understand women doing this work in the 70s across the whole decade, and how people come to their own sensibility, and also what does it mean to have a kind of politicized practice, which I think she really does, but in this very individual way of working, and yet the desire and need to collaborate in these public settings like ARR Gallery. And so she became for me a kind of way to map many women's experiences, but hers is very particular to being born and raised in New York, coming from a very working class family. She doesn't have the same kind of privilege that other women of her generation do, who are able to, are raised elsewhere, don't have to raise themselves effectively because she and her sister are orphaned so young. And I think that really contributes to a larger maybe headspace that she was in for her practice. I can't claim to know her, but I think she was really complex psychologically. And so for me, that was one of the primary means of trying to find my way through this material and understand what she was doing.
And it's fascinating in trying to kind of find this community or establish this community for herself. She also reaches out like so far in time in a way to also find this community amongst like historical figures, right? It's like a fascinating move, I think. We have another,
right.
another question.
I would also just follow up on that for a second and just say that I think that finding these historical figures is also a way of being able to project onto the past. You don't have to deal with living, breathing people in front of you, which are hard to deal with. And so I do quite find her to be like an irascible introvert. And that's part of why I think she's really interesting to sort of dig into.
Thank you. So another question is from Kendall. And they mentioned that you mentioned the emotive capacity of materials for the gossamer fabrics or the glassine paper on the moon tent that Mayer was using. And they wonder if you could talk a bit more about the other materials like blooms, streamers, snow, wax, etc. In other words, how does the kind of that emotive capacity appear, change or transform between the kind of fabrics and the blooms and the translucent paper, etc.?
I think that's a really good point. I think it becomes, I don't know, I haven't thought a lot about that, but you're right, it does transform and it becomes almost being able to let go completely, that in fact, the only documentation is going to be the photograph here or the end streamers of the balloons. And then there's this really ongoingly, achingly beautiful drawing practice that really anchors the work that I've added in here and there, which is that she did do these sketches, preparatory sketches of this kind of work. And I think that we see some of the same ideas here recur with the names or the groupings of names that are floating away, literally, like Catherine and Iris and Helen and the kind of larger pagan or mythological symbolisms attached to those names, and then floating up into the sky and gone forever, or the snow melting entirely and sort of, that's the end of the Annas or the Marys. And so I don't know, I think that there's something really poetic to this, in the sense that she's able to, in the late 70s and early 80s, maybe figure out a space of letting go completely, and not needing to, it becomes a dematerialized practice almost, in which there's no longer a sculpture, it's a temporary sculpture. And what that means for the work is anyone's guess, but even this becomes completely performative, and similar, I think, to it's a weird comparison, but not so weird, like James Turrell and his sky spaces. His become quite commercialized and reproduced in museums around the world. Why is this one not? And so then I think it's fair to make these kinds of comparative questions in contemporary practice of why one and not the other. And that's something that plagues me as an art historian, is why James Turrell has such a popular commercialized practice. Why did moon tent not take off as replicated in collectors' backyards?
Thank you. And then we have another question from Alexa, who says, thanks for the great talk, and would like to know how Mayer's work resurfaced and how or where did you first encounter it?
I first encountered it just in research from AIR Gallery. I was working at the Museum of Contemporary Art over, I guess, close to 2 decades ago as a research assistant on the WAC Art and Feminism show that was curated by Connie Butler, Art and the Feminist Movement. Rosemary Mayer made one of the early lists for being included in the show, but the show had a really international purview, and many Americans as a result fell off the list pretty early on. And she fell off the list, unfortunately. But that was my first encounter with her. But Robert is one of the co-curators of this show. It might be useful for you to jump in here and talk about the group of, you also maybe decided things by consensus. I don't know, but this was a group curatorial effort.
Yeah, so obviously the show at Spike Island is done in collaboration with the Swiss Institute in New York, Lemberg-Casse Munich, and Ludwig Forum in Aachen. And so we've worked together to kind of bring a whole bunch of work that we think is important to and needs to be seen to audiences in Germany, in the US, and in Bristol. And the show has taken slightly different forms and had different emphasis in the different locations. And so it feels that it's been wonderful also to think through in bringing the work to Europe, the fact that there's a brilliant work that's central to the show at Spike Island called Passages, which is actually an artist's book. And it's from the mid-70s, and it documents Mayer's first and only trip to Europe, where she goes and encounters all of these kind of works of art or architectural kind of spaces that she'd only ever read about in books or seen in pictures, right? And so there's this really nice kind of, I don't know, resonance in Germany or in the UK where she travels to both places, and it's great to be able to kind of bring that work and those resonances into these spaces. And I also first encountered the work through an art historian friend of mine who visited the archive, which has been very carefully cared for by Max and Marie Warsh, the niece and nephew of Rosemary, who've done huge work to really kind of bring this work and Mayer's importance to the fore, and that hard work over many years is really paying off. So it's really thanks to them that we've been able to do this project at all. Just as an FYI. And then there's one final question that I'd just like to ask, I think, before we wrap up, Jenny, which is also from Nella, which is whether or not you have any thoughts on Mayer's shifting focus from public figures, whether they're historical or mythological, to her own circuit of friends and family, and the work also becoming more ephemeral at that point too.
I don't know how to answer that exactly. I suspect Nella has some ideas about this, and I'd actually rather have her answer her own question.
Yeah, unfortunately, she's not on the call, so I can't.
But I do think that it is interesting to see the shift, and to also I don't know, locate these things as, I guess the last thing I would say about this is that these works in particular are on private property because they are essentially spaces that she was able to secure for herself through friends and family. It wasn't like she was being commissioned to do these things publicly. And I think that that's also one of the key pieces of her oeuvre, is that she had to make her own opportunities. And I think that these works that are quite compelling toward the end of this exhibition are about her making these outdoor opportunities. But why wasn't she invited to Storm King to do this kind of work? And so those are the questions I continue to ask myself and out loud as an art historian, is why did she not have a bigger representation in the art world? And I think her answer would be, that it was a kind of sexist world and that there wasn't opportunity, even though opportunity felt within reach. And so she had to make these opportunities and do these things where people would let her do them. And so I think that becomes, for me, like her friends and family, historians like Robert Hobbs, enable and help her realize her work, because she doesn't have an alternative space that's going to sponsor this. She doesn't have a commercial gallery. She hasn't been invited to a residency. And so she makes these opportunities that feel quasi, like residencies, but aren't really. And so I think that becomes a sort of lack that undergirds this earlier experience of, only getting to go to Europe once in her entire life, that she was working with limited means the entire time of her career.
Okay, have you got energy for one more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so final question then from Jimena, which is that was there in her context some previous use of textiles in a sculptural way? And Jimena says that they're thinking of the break that happened with Abercanowitz's textile sculptures in the 60s, for example.
Do I think that she had the same kind of break? No.
Well, yeah,
Is that what the question is? Yeah, like Abercanowicz, who I know is, the show has just opened at Tate Modern. I'm very sorry I can't see it, or I don't think I'm going to get back there, but it's she made a purposeful break to begin working with bronze as a way to permanize her practices that I think were also very ephemeral, and using, huge, large-scale weavings that she was forced to do in communist Poland. And, they had to be able to be rolled up and fit under the bed because that was the only storage she had. She didn't have real studio space. I think that was out of necessity. And I think that once she had a bigger, and let's just say Abercanowicz had a much bigger international space, reputation, sponsorship, to work outside of Poland, and to go get somebody like Richard Serra, for instance, who got the opportunity to grow his work and keep growing it, making it even bigger. That kind of thing requires sponsorship. It requires funding. It requires patronage. And, his own partner throughout the 70s was Joan Jonas, and her work still retains that kind of ephemeral, handmade quality that his doesn't. And so I think as a couple in the 70s, they're an important sort of touchstone for thinking about gender disparity and the problematics of the way women were continuously undermined within the art world, sort of larger fabric, if you will.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation and for responding so generously to the questions from our audience this evening. I just want to mention that Ways of Attaching is on view at Spike Island until Sunday, the 15th of January. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, please do come. We're open Wednesday to Sunday, 12 till 5. And yeah, please do pay attention to forthcoming public programs on our website, and continue to support Spike Island and our work. Thank you again, Jenny, and take care, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.